right, please welcome our special guest, Troy Jerome.
Thank you.
And I know it's a small crowd, but if you can still ask for the microphone so we can capture it for the cameras, that would be ideal. Troy, how are you?
Great.
What's it like watching yourself in that movie all these years later?
Yeah, it's quite an emotional feeling. I'm with my brother, so we're just chuckling away at some parts, feeling deeply emotional about other parts. I guess proud is one of the words that comes into my heart. The things that we did back then, we really pushed the limits and pushed as hard as we could and where we could. But coming back now and seeing what we've done since then, I'm glad, we to see the second part. Quite proud.
Because this movie is about 20 years after Alanis's first film about the 1981 raids. We're not quite 20 years after this movie, but close. So can you tell us a bit about where the community is today?
Yeah, and I think that what we should do is we talked about that briefly outside, we need a version 3. After this happened, a martial decision took place, and our people, became players in the commercial fishery, big players. And right now we're really out there, and we're fishing a lot of good snow crab. We have a big allocation of shrimp, and the 3 Mi'gmaq communities together, their portions. If you add it together, they have a good portion. A large percentage of the total catch out there. And what's more inspiring is that some of the people you see here at the time, they were just the fishermen, and there was a non-native Mi'gmaq or non-Mi'gmaq person that was the captain. But now our Mi'gmaq people are becoming captains, and when I see them, I'm getting my class whatever license it is soon. I was just having dinner with my wife's great grandmother or grandmother, and her cousin's there, and he says I'm taking my course soon to become a snow crab captain. But what happened after that? In 2000, the government of Quebec started implementing their wind energy program across Quebec. They have 40,000 megawatts across Quebec for energy, and they wanted 10% of wind power. So the Gaspésie is a very windy place, and they had a plan to install $4 billion worth of development, 1,660 megawatts. A lot of the wind power from all over Quebec is in the Gaspésie, and we were being left out. So in 2000, 2004, the Mi'gmaq put a bid into the Quebec government. We were not successful for whatever reason. And then what we did is through the Mi'gmaq Mawiomi, the entity that works for the 3 communities under a political accord, the 3 communities came together. We said, well, let's go after wind together. And I led a negotiation table there on behalf of the 3 chiefs, and I had a very good team, of course. But we secured a 150 megawatt wind farm project for our people. So in the commercial fisheries, we are underfunded like most First Nations across Canada. We're funded at 60%. So when our kids go to school, they get 60 cents on the dollar compared to other Canadians. And that's throughout, social services, education, and almost all aspects. So we said we need to create our own revenue. The martial decision for us, we were we need $100 million to fund the governance for our 3 communities. We were getting about 55. Commercial fisheries brought in an additional $5 million. And through the agreement that we secured nation to nation with the Quebec government on wind energy, we're now producing 150 megawatts of wind energy, and we're going to bring in a approximate profits of another $10 million a year to our governance. So when we look back over the last 8 years, that's quite a feat. I know one of the lawyers from Montreal here says, it's like pulling fire from the dragon to be able to go and get an agreement from the Quebec government and Hydro-Quebec. And it's quite a substantial project, 150 megawatts. And we became operational December 30th, this just past Christmas.
Now, so much of, the government, the government's interest is obviously in natural resources and the continued development. How much of it is a model of what we see here for how we do this in other communities? Because, of course, a lot of reconciliation is sort of couched on this idea of access to resources and partnerships. This community seems like perhaps something of a model in terms of how this could be achieved across Canada.
Yeah, I guess when you look at the 3 communities following this, we knew that we were, somewhat disconnected from our other brothers and sisters in the other 2 communities. So we formed a political accord in August 4, 2000, right at this time. and the three communities came together. And then we got organized, and we stated, this is our territory from Riverloo to Gaspé in a formal document, and we submitted that to the government. So I think that from there, I guess we could say, being organized and having a clear vision of that you own the land. First and foremost, we own the land. Let's get that straight. We were here first. But our treaties that we signed in 1700s, it was saying that we're ready to share with the non-Mi'gmaq people. We're not saying, you need to leave, but we definitely need our fair share. And I think what comes in mind after you get yourself organized and, you get in a place of comfort saying, this is ours. We take a reverse idea of the treaties now. People say that we have treaty rights. We're like, no. Canadians have treaty rights. We sign treaties with them, allowing them to stay and sharing with them. And I think that once we get that clearly in our head, in our own consciousness, we would come one step further. So what's going on in our communities now? The three communities are saying, okay, we've done this. We went through an economic development phase, but now we need to get to governance. We need to implement our governing institutions. So we are putting a Gaspé-Kawogi management plan in place, which would have a plan to manage our whole territory. And when you look at a lot of the argument there, we're talking to Quebec, going to Quebec, trying to get an allocation out of Quebec, I would say that's the wrong thinking. We need to get to the place and say, okay, here's our management plan. Where's your management plan? Okay, bring your management plan here. Put them on the table. Where they overlap, there's a process that we need a reconciliation to settle those places where it overlaps. Where they don't overlap, you don't bother us in those areas. Okay, you go. We don't bother you in these areas. We go. But where we come together, where there's issues together, that's where we need to have this reconciliation process. So you hear Trudeau and you hear all these kind of things over the last years, reconciliation. And people have I guess, they don't understand. A lot of people don't understand what reconciliation is. Some of our people, too, is that we don't need to reconcile with them. It's ours. They need to reconcile with us. But they are in a position of power because, because of the way democracy rolls out in Canada. So I think that the model, if you would see it at the end, is that, you progress through these stages. And the stage where we're at right now is saying, okay, in Listuguj, they didn't want us to fish the way we wanted to fish. And if we would have went to court without a proper management plan, maybe we would not have won. So let's get organized around that. Let's put our management plan in place. Now, in Listuguj, they kept trying to get more trees to cut and trying to get them to cut less trees at the same time, protect the environment. But just a couple of years ago now, the director of natural resources just said, okay, you know what, Quebec? We're going to cut another 50,000 cubic meters. That's our allocation. So we've gone past that point. Now we're saying, it's ours. Just like what we thought there when we went to cut the trees on, in our own companies. Now we're saying, this is what we're going to take, 50,000 extra. So you need to reconcile it on your side. If we think that there can only be 140,000 cubic meters that could be cut in this area, you need to cut less, 50,000 cubic meters less, and you need to go to $90,000. And if that doesn't work, you can take us to court. It was the same as back then, right? Take us to court. We'll prove it in the courts. And in a lot of different areas is that when you look at what happened in the Marshall decision in 1999, it becomes very clear that if you get to court and you have a proper, proper process to get to the court, we were here first. And that's the message I think that we should all take back and remember. We have a sacred connection to the land. For a long time, that sacred connection was withered away, through residential schools and a lot of other means from the Indian Act. We had a pass system, you couldn't leave the reserves, and all those kind of crazy things that we went through, right? So let's get beyond that. Let's get beyond that. We need to fight with someone. Let's get to the place where we need our own management plan. We need to take care of our own affairs. We need to fund our own government. We need to create our own institutions, and then we need to bring the plan to the Crown and say, okay, well, let's have a reconciliation process.
So this is really the nation-to-nation relationship that Trudeau and the government suggests they want, or at least gives lip service that they want this. And you guys are actually, this is the pathway, this is the community's pathway, the three communities, to actual sovereignty and a nation-to-nation relationship with the Crown.
Yeah. You have to take your affairs into your own hands. In the United States and again in Canada in the late 70s and early 80s, they talk about self-determination. And that was a buzzword for a long time, self-determination. And I think that we said it so much that we forgot what it meant. It's like economic development now. You say it so much, it's like, what is that? But where we're coming into the point, there's a number of nations across Canada that are doing something like us. They're getting ready to say, okay, we're just going to implement our own management plan over the territory. And there's in the Delgamo case, there's an inescapable economic component tied to title. So that would be the revenues we would take in. Okay, we're going to fund our government. Okay, we need to make these institutions, and we need to make them in a culturally appropriate way. So when you look at what we were doing there, fishing, people went to people in the garages and said, how should we fish? And they said, this is the way we should fish. And should we charge people? Well, no, you can't charge people, but what we can do is say, you have a right, but you must have respect for that right. So the first time you're wrong, okay, what we want to do is bring you back in a circle. So we'll train you, teach you. Say, okay, this is the way you should be fishing. Okay, yes, I got it. And if you disrespect it again, say, okay, well, you're going to lose your net for the night. So now we're going to remember, next time you'll remember. And at a certain point, if you keep not listening, at a certain point it becomes obvious you're not listening, then you lose your privilege or your right for the year. So in that way, it's a culturally appropriate management plan. So if we would have said, it's a $50 fine, make me pay. What kind of entity are you? Are you another white government or non-Mi'gmaq government to do this to me? No. Culturally appropriate said, okay, this is how we would do it. The communities came together and they respected it. So, and there's give and take. It's not black and white. I oftentimes have said I'm quite black and white, but the management plan is not black and white. What matters at the end is how many salmon are in the pools, how many salmon are making up river, how many salmon are spawning and going back out and coming back in. And like Wendell said, we won an award saying one of the best managed rivers. That speaks a lot.
I get asked often because, I'll talk about returning the land and that co-managing or co-stewardship of the land. And this is really an example for folks of how that can actually be achieved in a real world setting, in a contemporary political setting. Lots of questions I have for you. Talk a little bit about the different styles of management. Because, of course, when Indigenous people talk about management plans, and I always often call them stewardship as opposed to management, because it's the idea of keeping the land as opposed to. So can you talk a bit about how that is reflective of the approach of the nation, of the communities, and the sustainability behind those sorts of ideals?
Yeah, and I think that we're getting there, and even as Mi'gmaq people, we're not all red, and we're not all following a red road. Even in inside our own camps, we're struggling to say, okay, well, how should we do it? But one thing that we do know is that you should use the land only to a certain extent. And it's a concept in our language called Negotiator. So some people say you only take what you need. Others are saying, well, we've got to make sure that when we leave this part of the land, that land can recoup and be able to provide again. And I think that's the thing that we're struggling with, is that because in the society that we're dealing with, the Quebec government, the way it manages it, it kind of overuses the resource. And when we're coming there, we said, okay, well, we need enough for us. You need to back away a bit. And now it comes down to a jurisdictional thing. So I think that what we need to be able to understand in terms of things of management is that we need to go to the federal government or the provincial government oftentimes in terms of resources, the jurisdictions in the provincial government, that we need to get them to understand the way we think and the way we expect things to happen. And if we do it this way, and if they could see that, there could be more for us, more for them. 1 + 1 = 3. That's the challenge. That's the challenge, to be able to go to a machine. In Canada, people say it's all democracy-led. I say that the ones that have more money have more votes in one way or another. They have a lot of media, and they're out there. And you look at, I'm not going to name any people that are winning in these governments right here now, but they tend to be the ones with more money are getting there. So when we're dealing with our people in the Gaspésie, for example, we look at them and we relate to them quite well. They look at us and they relate, quite similarly. We drive skidoos, we drive four-wheelers, we hunt moose, and all of the things that we do like the normal Gisbegawagi citizens, the normal Gaspésians. It's the crown machines that we have troubles with. And the crowns have too much power, and I think when they take the resource, there's not enough of the money or the resource the monies that come in from the resource that's going to the people, Mi'gmaq and non-Mi'gmaq. It's going to these big machines. So that's the thing that we're up against when we're saying, okay, we're going to manage our territory and this is how much we're going to have. If we don't really push our arms out like this and take more, the corporations would have it. So that's the challenge. And Quebec right now, where we are, they're saying, okay, we're going to protect a certain amount of the land. It's going to go from 3% to 12%. So we're trying to be right there with them to say, okay, let's do this together. For example, when in our territory now, if we want to make a birch bark canoe, you cannot find white birch trees that are large enough to make that. So they're saying, okay, we're going to protect this area here. We're saying, well, let's protect this area here where there's a white birch tree stand, and it'll have dual benefits. It'll be able to protect the land, and we'll go in that area and we'll just collect the trees for making canoes. Dual purpose kind of things. So we keep coming to them, and I think maybe that they're starting to see it. Okay, there's no hidden agenda here. You know, they're not trying to pull something on us. They're really trying to work with us, and that's one of the things that we did with the wind power thing. We came to see them, and we said, listen, if you give this allocation to this company here, those profits are going to Chicago. If you give that same allocation that looks the exact same way, that 150 megawatts to a Mi'gmaq community, or these 3 Mi'gmaq communities, when the profit lands here, it's going to land in the Mi'gmaq hands. And the Mi'gmaq, they don't save too much money. They spend it all.
It lands in Quebec and New Brunswick and everywhere around.
And it doubles and triples there.
Yeah.
And in Chicago, it's gone. Yeah. So we went to them and we kept showing them that we were very organized. We knew what we wanted. If they gave us an allocation to the Mi'gmaq, it solves the whole Mi'gmaq problem for the whole province. So we need to be innovative. We need to bring solutions to the table. We need to be firm. But at the end, you know, we need to be able to show our people that this makes sense for us in the long term. And you show them, you know, saying, this is how we are going to meet your interest. The children in our school need more money. That machine, that Canadian machine, they're being brought to court. The machines have said it, you know, that they should be getting the same amount of money. It still hasn't happened. They keep bringing them back to the tribunal to say, you must do it. We said, okay, we need to bring some of this own money in. Those are our children, you know. So that's the end goal at the end, to say, okay, we have 7 generations. We need to think out. You know, this is not a hogwash thing. We need to think that way. We need to do something in this generation now, so when they come, they have an easier time. And we did it in 81. We did it in 98. And now we just did it with the wind, and we don't know what the next thing is. People ask, you know, what's next? And I think, you know, I'm 51 now. I was telling you earlier. It's starting to get to the point where the 30, 40-year-olds need to come and tell us, you know, what they want.
So many things I want. So many things to follow up. I mean, in terms of good management, it's not only more right now; it's more for longer. Is also key to the idea of stewardship. One point that keeps coming up in the movie, and then I'll turn it over to you folks, is that the protests. None of this comes without the protests, and I think it's a really important point for when we think of the relationship between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and the state. That is the history right across the country, that there really have not been gains for our people without protest.
Yeah, and I think at the end that on the wind power thing, again, going back to, because, you know, it's just happened. Yeah. That's one thing where we managed to say, okay, to the government, we're not going to negotiate in the media. So throughout that, we had a deputy minister that was really ready to speak with us, and we were organized, and we kept moving along. We were quite diligent, but quite, how to say it, you know, it took 7 years to get there, 7, 8 years. We were firm, we kept going forward. But we had a strategy that was on the other side. We stayed at the table, but we told them, you know, it's like these, all these projects here, and we went to all the developers. We said, you have a very big problem. You have a power purchase agreement, but not one power purchase agreement has there been a consultation with Mi'gmaq people. And we actually brought a developer in with the Quebec government. We said, just hold on a second, we're going to start the meeting, but we're going to just talk to them just for a minute, okay? Just be patient. So the Quebec government's there, and we're saying, wind power, yeah. Consultations, can you tell us what you've done with the Mi'gmaq, in all consultations with the Mi'gmaq people? Well, they said, well, we met with Mr. Kondo at Geskebigyak. Oh, you did? Okay, good. And what did you say? And they said, you know, we talked about this project. And what was Mr. Kondo's comments? This. Okay, what else was said? And they're like, no, that was it. We're like, okay, a 2-minute conversation, $4 billion worth of development. You all have contracts, you know, for $300 million, $500 million, $1.2 billion to develop wind power project, and there's no consultations. So we told the industry, we said, we're going to go after one of your wind farms, the one with the most money, the one with the least money, the biggest one, the smallest one, the one ready to fall over, but we will take one of your projects down. But what you should do, you should call the deputy premier, and if you're spending $500 million, we know you know their number. Call them up and say, you gave me a power purchase agreement with a big hole in it. I got through en français. It's got a big hole in it. What are you doing to me? And then we told the developers, the next thing that you should do is you should tell the Quebec government that these Mi'gmaq seem to know what they want. They're organized and they're talking, wind just the same way we're talking about, technically, up and down. We had everything that we needed to be able to put the project forward. So I think at one point, it could have spilled over into the highway, but maybe they were wiser in this case, and we were more organized. And
They've learned apparently maybe
and
a
they
little
see
bit.
that these are the same people that did this, a couple of times, and that the people are behind them. And we did have meetings in our community, 200-300 people there, because we said, there's going to be employment opportunities and what have you. And when we finished our project, just in employment for just off course for a second, we did have 300 Mi'gmaq workers worked on this wind farm project that we did. So that was phenomenal for us to be able to make that. So I think that it doesn't always have to go that way. It seems like it has to, but we told them, let's keep coming back to the table. They said, and one thing, the three communities together, we were able to sustain through Indian Act elections. Because three communities are together, this chief would change, but the other two were there. And then maybe this one changed, but the other two were there. And we kept going forward, saying, this is what we're going to have. This is what we're going to have. So by that political stability, I think that's the key when you look at what's going on. If we get in a position where we have more monies coming in, more programs and services for our people, then we wouldn't be changing our chiefs so often. Right. And when the chiefs come in, they start a project and they could be there for the 8 years that it takes to see it through. So I think on our side, that's what, we need to fund our government a little more, be a little more savvy at doing that.
All right, folks, just raise your hand so we can get a microphone to you if you have any questions. Otherwise, Troy and I will just keep talking. Wow.
Maybe they like to
there's one there. We'll just let us get the microphone to you so the folks at home can hear you. It's out on the YouTube.
Such a privilege to have you here, and this whole story is very inspirational. And I'm just curious about the stability in the community in terms of the younger people. Are they leaving? Are they staying? Maybe with this wind power project, it's more of a retention strategy too for the community. But I'm just curious about how the population changes over time and how you respond to that.
Yeah, I think that, we're a bit steady. It's, people are leaving. It's at a steady pace leaving. One thing, through social media, we see that the connection's there more. So my brother is living in Toronto here, but we're way more connected to him now through social media and other means. And one thing that we're, hopefully with the wind power, that's what I keep seeing, in 20 years from now, what would it look like? We had a gentleman from the Native Nation Institute come see us, Manly Bigay. Do you know Manly? So we had a talk with our chiefs and our leadership in an assembly there, and he said, one of the things we need to invest in, so we get this wind farm revenue, we need to invest in our community, invest in our young people, have political stability, because we need a safe place for them to invest. And when we mean investing, they go back to university, but they would come back to the community and work for the band council or create their own business. And if you don't have that political stability, they're going to be like, well, would I start a business here? Back in my community? No, it's going to be too hard, or I won't be able to be successful. And I think that's still our challenge, is to be able to get into place to say, okay, politically speaking, even if there's differences between political parties like there always is, we should can try to get to a common vision, talk to people more, and get there. So I think that our retention's getting a little better each year. It's certainly not going down where more people are leaving, but it's a big challenge to provide employment for all the people that are going to university and are coming back.
Well,
and maybe one more thing. In terms of the trades, we did break the barrier when we built the wind farm. Our people would go working in the States and working in Alberta, for example. Only 2 people were certified to work in the province of Quebec before we started that. When we finished, we had 87. So trades is very big as well. We focus too much, I think, all the time on university, and we should be focusing somewhat too on on all the different aspects in the trades. And there's a lot of people now that are licensed practitioner and workers too. So we're entering more fields, instead of just saying, okay, band council employees.
Well, I have the mic. I'm going to ask another question because I'm really curious about this one. For a province that has wanted to be its own nation, right? Self-determination for Quebec. The way they treat the First Nations, I'm trying to make sense out of that. I would think of any province that would understand, wouldn't it be one that wants its own, its own country as well? So I'm really curious about your thoughts on that and how it differs or is similar to how other provinces relate to their First Nations communities.
Yeah, no, that's big, and we've used that a number of times when we have discussions with them. We're saying you look at us, and you may have a different opinion of us, or you can't seem to understand the interest that we're talking about, and then we say that this is like what you're talking about. This is the exact same thing. And when Canada was formed, the Mi'gmaq were allies with the French. These same people that were there, their forefathers, we were with them, and we were siding with them, and in the early battles we were there. At the end, when the treaties came and the wars were ending. We stayed neutral, but right from the beginning, we helped the Quebec people, survive on this land. I think that not enough Quebecers understand their own history, to be truthful, and they don't understand that, when they're saying, we want our own independence. That when they look at Mi'gmaq people, like one of the ladies say here, what right are they talking about today? It's always the same right that we've been talking about. I think that media has a big role in the past, 2-3 decades, maybe less and less, because we're getting more astute, and we're really out there, and we're really able to say more about what we're talking about than previously. They would come in, take our picture, and leave. So it's a big challenge still. And just in terms of other provinces, I know Nova Scotia a little bit. They have, what they tell us is that they have a very good relationship with the provincial government. The Mi'gmaq there in Nova Scotia are dotted throughout the whole province, okay, and it's one nation. So that makes it easier. In Quebec, you have multiple different nations. And for us Mi'gmaq people over the Gaspésie, the way they situated us, the territory goes like this. They put one community here, and the other community, there's not even a reserve there per se. They're there, and they only got recognized in 1992. So we have a lot of challenges, and I think that when you see the change from 81 to 98 today, I think, it's like compounding interest. We're getting stronger and stronger.
I mean, I think I'll just also chime in. I mean, I think one of the challenges with Quebec is that culturally, they for a very long time now have always been positioned as the other in the larger Canadian landscape. They're the society attempting to protect themselves, and I think within that strata, it then becomes hard to actually recognize that even within your own territory, there's someone. It's hard to make room for another, if you know what I mean. And I think that's been a real challenge, and still presents, culturally a larger challenge. But we shouldn't be foolish. It's like Quebec. There's a nuance to it, but the rest of Canada sort of operates not that far from that. It's a nuanced difference, but I think that's, for me, has been the crux. Is they're in a struggle to preserve their own culture, and in that struggle, others' struggle can actually become obscured.
Yeah, like in Quebec, they have a territorial minister. So they have occupied a territory. So in our communities, in our territory, they're giving people vacationing lots, 10-year kind of leases to be out on the land all over the place. And we're starting to run into those people. And they're starting to, so here's the river, and they have 1 or 2 there. So we said, okay, we can still go to the river, but they give out 4 more, and then 6 more. And then we're like, okay, we can't even go to the river now. So now we're starting to butt heads with regular Gaspésians over these kind of things. But the Quebec government has maybe a thing over Quebec as I would have said over Canada as a whole, and they want to be able to say, well, we're in the whole territory, in their whole territory, their territorial integrity thing. So that's going to be a challenge, and I know I'm working on one file now and saying, okay, what is it that we want at the end? And I think that's what we have to go back at. Where does this all come from? What are we really talking about?
And ultimately, to your point, I mean, the presence of more Indigenous voices in the media, social media, movies like this, I think help in a long-term view of the culture will actually help us get to a place where that's less of a concern. I think the education process in this country is still very much ongoing and in the early, Canada's very much like is it out of kindergarten? Maybe it's in grade like 1 or 2. Like it's pretty early in its educational life in terms of even its own history. So I think a lot of that still has to happen for our children to maybe live in a slightly different paradigm when it comes to the relationship. More questions? Oh, we've silenced them, Troy. I was going to ask you a question about Indian Act chiefs, hereditary chiefs. That's an ongoing conflict within not just those communities, the Mi'gmaq communities, but right across. We see this coming up in BC a lot in terms of, again, when it comes to resource agreements. Can you maybe give a little bit of background for the folks and sort of how, again, how that's been dealt with in the communities in Listuguj and Restuguj?
Yeah. It's a challenge, you know. So what's going on is that the band councils are the elected machines, and you know they are administering programs. They're large about administering programs when you look at it, and then but that band council is also there to fight for us, you know, defend us, and to try to push the limits against the Indian Act and being out in the territory. And what jurisdiction do they have? So that it comes down, what jurisdiction to have. It's still unclear, I think, across Canada. And then we have our hereditary chiefs. But I guess we've been so mainstream for so long, is that we have a hard time saying, okay, how do we reconcile ourselves with these hereditary chiefs? And when you look at them, the operation that the things that they're trying to do, they're having discussions here and they're having discussions there, and they're expected to not use computers and not do boardroom things and all those kind of things. So how does that come into 2017? It's very challenging. So we haven't been able to reconcile it yet. It's still an ongoing challenge. We have right now another hereditary chief in our community, and he's kind of the Listuguj hereditary chief, but back in the day it would be over the whole territory. Gespegawagi would be one hereditary chief, and that would be 7 communities or 8 communities. So all of Aabiziingwashi and all the way to the Miramichi River. Okay, so that's big, and then you would have smaller community chiefs. So what happened is that the church, because that was the machine, that was the crown at the time. We would have a chief, and he would be doing things and getting organized and getting things moving, and kind of challenging the crown, like talking about early Indian Act, late 1800s. And they would change the chief, just like that. Okay, he's too organized, he's too smart, he's not kneeling enough, so okay, you're not the chief no more, this guy's the chief now. So, we had to deal with that, and I would say, like in our community, around 1910, there's kind of a bright light that happens. So there's an industrialization of everything, and people leave the forest, and there's the logging and all that stuff going around. So people are looking for employment, people start farming into communities and these kind of things. And that sort of disappears, and it goes away. And now, people are trying to bring it back, but then chiefs and councils change so often, and our communities are in very, very, how would I say it, there's so much need going on, they go look to the person that could provide them a job. And the hereditary chief is not there, they have no jobs. So we keep just looking at this side and not looking at that side. I remember the Gitnyao, there was a court decision in British Columbia where they were cutting trees, and the BC government went to the band council. They said, okay, so what do we do here? They said, well, go talk to the elders over there. That's the hereditary chiefs. Go talk to them. And they're like, no, we're asking you. We need to deal with you. And they're like, no, you can't deal with us. When you're talking about things that are outside the reserve on the territory, you need to talk to them. So it went to court, and the judge says, that thing stands. The Gitnyao hereditary chiefs or the elders are the governing body. But it's so weird that we need the court to tell us that for us to recognize that. So I don't know where we're going to go on that.
Yeah, colonialism does amazing things. It's really messed us up. If you want a question, all right.
So I'm just wondering, will the government's provincial just claw back funding that Native communities are managing to generate or earn? You know what I mean? They're like, oh, you guys got 100 million last year, and it looks like you're going to earn 80, so we're going to remove, that much funding that we were going to send your way. Now, too bad. And then we're stuck to where we were instead of moving ahead.
Yeah, people have asked us about that, especially when we talk about education. So we're going to make this number, $10 million a year, and at the end they're saying, okay, well, they're going to do the math and do this. What we said is that in terms of education, if anyone worked at band councils or knows the system at all, we've been cut so much, and over deliberate period of time, that we're kind of numb to it, and we're just used to it being cutting. So the attitude that we took at the time was, say, you know what, we're being cut, and we're going to be diminished anyway. We shouldn't even look at them in the first place. Here's our territory. Here's all our resources. Why are we still stuck being dependent on this machine, this crown machine? Let's focus our attention away from that crown towards our resources. And can we do that management of our resources effectively, extract resources in some kind of sustainable manner, and go forward like that? So I think that's where the attention needs to lie, and say, what's the crown going to do? That is the distraction. What are we going to do? That's where our focus can be. That should be. So when we talk about nation building, the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development showed us a number of stories, a number of lessons. Those that asserted their sovereignty vigorously, those that had a long-term thinking, that think strategically, and that were able to build institutions that were culturally appropriate, like our fishing law, those are the ones that succeed. The ones that rely on the crown or keep dealing with this kind of thing, they're further behind.
I want to remind you folks that this series continues a month from today. May 13th, we'll be back with Real Injun, a movie that features me, along with many others. We'll have a whole Indigenous media panel, so I encourage you to come out of this. Troy, thank you so much for coming here, and thank you so much for the work you do for your people. Mi'gmaq, Chi Mi'gmaq. Thank you, folks, for listening and for coming.
Thank you very much.
That was great.
Yeah,
Yeah, we ran
all over the place.
quite a bit.